Good evening and welcome to tonight's Undaunted, bringing to the news on top stories. I am Onyi. Let's begin. Nearly 10 years after the outbreak of the Amazonian war in southern Cameroon, growing concerns are emerging over the government's continued reliance on military force. Despite years of bloodshed, displacement, and instability, the debate has resurfaced strongly following the Pope's recent visit to Bambili, a trip widely viewed as a moral appeal for peace and reconciliation in the war-hit nation. While the Vatican maintained its traditional neutrality, observers believe the visit underscored increasing international concern over a crisis that has resisted military efforts and continued to devastate civilian population. Critics argue that the war, which began in 2016 as peaceful protests by Amazonian lawyers and teachers against perceived marginalization, escalated after the government adopted a headline response that included arrest, internet shutdowns, and the banning of what was called the Cameroun Anglophone Civil Society Consortium. Human rights groups and conflict analysts have long warned that repression would deepen tension and fuel armed resistance. Today, with Amazonian and military operations still ongoing, many Cameroonians and international observers are questioning whether a military solution can truly end the war. As calls intensifies for inclusive dialogue, compromise, justice, and national reconciliation. That is the question begging for answer. But let's answer that after the prime headlines. Well, tonight, security concerns persist in southern Cameroon. Also tonight, to take a look at the French Cameroon soldier killed, another injured in an attack near Noni-Nkambe axis. Tonight, to take a look at business reopening Bambili after 2-day shutdown over land dispute. Tonight, also, southern Cameroon crisis nears a decade mark as calls grows for dialogue over military solution. On the African scene, the Malian army launches overnight strikes on rebel-held Kidal. While on the global scene, BRICS foreign ministers convene in New Delhi as global crisis tests bloc unity. Now let's get the news in full briefings. Concerns over insecurity in southern Cameroon continues to dominate public discussion as renewed incidents of violence in part of the Amazonia highlights the fragile security situation despite repeated claims of stability in some local communities. Observers say a pattern has emerged over the years in which residents in certain towns insist their areas remain unaffected by the war until deadly attacks or clashes occur. Recent incidents, including the killing of a gendarme officer in Noni-Nkambe and violence linked to nearby Undaunted, have reignited concerns about the continuing instability in the area. In Amazonia, tensions also resurfaced following a deadly shooting incident earlier this week in Barr, underscoring fears that the war remains unresolved despite periods of relative calm in some urban centers. Security forces, including soldiers and gendarmes, remain heavily deployed across towns and villages in Amazonia as authorities continued efforts to contain what they target separatist violence and trying to maintain order. Analysts note that the sustained military presence reflects the ongoing nature of the war, which has persisted for years and displaced thousands of civilians. Religious and community leaders have repeatedly called for dialogue, reconciliation, and long-term political solutions to address the root causes of the war. Attention has also focused on Bambili, considered a major center in the war, and the headquarters of the Bambili ecclesiastical province, covering both the southern Cameroons. Calls are growing for unity and constructive engagement among communities, with many emphasizing that acknowledging the reality of the war is essential to achieving lasting peace and preventing further loss of lives. Now let's get into this report that captures the so many loss of lives. Now, one French Cameroon soldier was killed and another injured in an attack on Wednesday evening at Remy, a village located between Noni and Nkambe in the Savannah zone of the Federal Republic of Amazonia. Local sources said the Amazonian State Army opened fire on the French Cameroon military unit operating in the area. The wounded soldier sustained a leg injury and was evacuated for a medical team. The attack is believed to have been carried out by the Amazonian State Army, who have been repeatedly attacked or targeted by the French Cameroon Army along the Noni-Nkambe corridor. Colonial authorities have not issued an official statement on the attack as of today, Thursday's morning. Security presence in the area has reportedly been reinforced. The Noni-Nkambe road has remained a hotspot in the ongoing Amazonian war, with frequent clashes and ambushes affecting both civilians and security personnel. Residents in surrounding villages continue to call for increased protection and a reduction in hostilities. Away from that, let's get into Bambili, where business activities have resumed in Bambili following a 2-day shutdown linked to an ongoing land dispute with the neighboring Nkambe community. Shops, markets, and transport services reopened on Thursday, restoring movement and commercial activities across the town. However, many residents say fears remain high as authorities have yet to announce a permanent resolution to the territorial conflict. The shutdown was enforced earlier this week by local inhabitants protesting against the disputed land boundaries between the two communities. The action temporarily halted economic activities and disrupted daily life in the area. Despite the return to normal activities, traders say the closure caused significant financial losses, particularly for sellers of perishable goods. No solution has been made yet, a female trader at the Bambili market said. She explained that several of her plantains and other food items spoiled during the shutdown, adding that customers are no longer willing to buy the softened produce because of its condition. Other business owners have called on administrative authorities to urgently resolve the dispute to prevent further disruptions in security and economic hardship. Although the streets of Bambili are once again busy, uncertainty continues to hang over the community as residents await final decisions from the administration that could guarantee lasting peace between the two villages. Away from that, let's head into southern Cameroon, where the conflict in southern Cameroon is nearing a decade, with increasing criticisms over the government's continued reliance on military force rather than political dialogue. Renewed attention has followed the Pope's recent visit to Bambili, which many observers view as a symbolic appeal for peace and reconciliation in the crisis-hit southern Cameroon. Although the Vatican maintains neutrality in political matters, analysts believe the Pope likely encouraged President Paul Biya to address Amazonian grievances through dialogue and concessions, including the possible release of detainees connected to the war. Peace advocates say meaningful negotiations remains essential to ending years of violence and mistrust. Critics argue that the crisis began as a peaceful protest movement in 2016 led by the Amazonian lawyers and teachers who opposed to marginalization in the legal and education systems. At the time, what they tagged as armed groups had not yet emerged. However, tension escalated after the government outlawed the Southern Cameroun Civil Society Consortium, shut down internet services in Southern Cameroon, and arrested protest leaders including human rights lawyer Barr. Human rights organizations including Amnesty International accuse security forces of using excessive force against civilians during protests in Bambili and other towns. The International War Group had earlier warned that harsh repression of Amazonian dissent could trigger an armed uprising, a prediction that later materialized into what has been known as the Amazonian State Army and what they call as separatist fighters because they took up arms against the state. Nearly 10 years later, the war continued to claim lives and disrupt livelihood despite ongoing military oppression. Analysts and peace advocates now argue that a military solution has failed to restore stability, urging both the government and the ASA to embrace compromise, justice, reconciliation, and inclusive dialogue as the only viable path towards lasting peace. Oh well, that's all we have for you from the home front. But when we return from the break, we'll head into Africa, where Malian army has launched an overnight strike on rebel-held Kidal. The Army of Mali reportedly carried out a series of overnight airstrikes from Wednesday into Thursday on the northern desert town of Kidal, a strategic stronghold currently controlled by Tuareg rebels and allied jihadist fighters. According to local residents, at least 4 explosions were heard across the town late Wednesday night, causing significant material damage and raising fears of renewed escalation in the volatile northern region. Witnesses said several areas of the town were struck, including a residential neighborhood near a former market where one house was reportedly destroyed. The strikes comes weeks after Tuareg separatist group and the fighters linked to the Jin jihadist coalition launched coordinated attacks across northern Mali in late April. Their uncommon alliance enabled a swift offensive that overwhelmed several strategic military positions and further weakened government control in the area. Kidal, long considered a symbolic and strategic center of rebellion in northern Mali, has remained at the heart of tensions between the Malian state separatist movement and Islamic armed groups. The latest development shows the fragile security situation in the Sahel, where armed groups continue to exploit instability despite ongoing military operations by regional forces. Residents said panic spread through parts of the town following the strikes, with some families fleeing affected neighborhoods overnight. While there were no immediate reports of casualties, the attacks damaged civilian property and heightened concerns over further violence in the coming days. The Malian military has not yet released an official assessment of the operation and independent verification of the extent of the damage. It remains difficult due to restricted access to the area. The renewed fighting shows the growing security challenges facing Mali's transactional and transitional authorities as the country grapples with the insurgencies, separatist movements, and deteriorating humanitarian conditions across the north. We return right after the break. We'll head into the globe, where BRICS foreign ministers convene in New Delhi as global crisis test bloc unity. Foreign ministers from the BRICS bloc began a 2-day high-level meeting in New Delhi on Thursday as member nations seek common ground on mounting geopolitical and economic challenges facing the developing world. The gathering includes representatives from founding members Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, alongside diplomats from recently admitted member countries as the bloc continues its expansion and growing global influence. The talks are taking place against the backdrop of escalating tensions linked to the conflict involving Iran, persistent volatility in global oil and gas markets, and concerns over slowing economic growth across several major economies. Analysts say the developments are testing the cohesion of BRICS, whose members often hold differing positions on international security and foreign policy issues. Energy security, trade cooperation, supply chain stability, and the use of local currencies in cross-border transactions are expected to feature prominently during the discussions. Ministers are also expected to address reform of international financial institutions and efforts to strengthen the voice of emerging economies in global decision-making bodies. The meeting marks another step in BRICS' broader push to expand its diplomatic and economic footprint amid shifting global alliances and increasing competition between major world powers. Observers say the bloc's ability to maintain unity despite internal differences will be closely watched by international markets and policymakers. India, which is hosting the summit, is expected to emphasize multilateral cooperation, regional stability, and stronger economic ties among developing nations as it seeks to position itself as a leading voice within the global south. And that's it for tonight's Undaunted. But before we go, let's take a look at the reports that made it to the headlines. Well, tonight on Undaunted, we told you that security concerns is persistent in southern Cameroun. Also tonight, French Cameroon soldier killed, another injured in an attack near Noni-Nkambe axis. Tonight, we told you that businesses reopen in Bambili after 2-day shutdown over land dispute, while in southern Cameroun, the crisis is nearing a decade and marks are calling for growth for dialogue over military solution. On the African scene, we told you the Malian army has launched an overnight strike on rebel-held Kidal, while the BRICS foreign ministers convened in New Delhi as global crisis test bloc unity. That's it for tonight's Undaunted. Sincerest apologies for not being able to have Barrister Mbeseha on tonight, but hopefully over the weekend he will definitely join. On behalf of the team behind tonight's production, it's good night and God bless you.